In the stifling southern town of Grimsby lurks a heinous criminal dubbed Southern Cannibal. Detective Holloway delves into a dark legacy to unmask the monster, unraveling a tale of blood, madness, and a town's haunting reckoning with evil. Chapter 1. The Unseen Horror. In the suffocating heat of a southern summer night, the small town of Grimsby slept uneasily. The moon hung low, casting long shadows across the abandoned streets and boarded-up stores. An unsettling quietness gripped the town, broken only by the sporadic chirping of crickets. At the edge of Grimsby, an old, weather-beaten house stood isolated, its presence almost ghostly. Ivy clung to its walls like desperate fingers, and the windows, dirty and cracked, gave nothing away of the horrors inside. In the heart of this forsaken dwelling, the killer moved with a disturbing grace. Tall and gaunt, his eyes gleamed with a cold, unnerving light as he prepared his macabre meal. His kitchen was a nightmarish scene, hooks hanging from the ceiling, a table stained with blood, and jars filled with unspeakable relics of his previous victims. Each movement he made was methodical, practiced, the slicing of flesh, the grinding of bone. He hummed softly, an old lullaby, disjointed and eerie in the stillness of his lair. The air was thick with the scent of iron and fear. Outside, the world remained oblivious to the darkness festering at its edges. Grimsby, once a lively community, had become a shadow of itself, plagued by recent disappearances and unspoken fears. As the night deepened, the killer paused, his senses sharp and alert. He knew the time was nearing, the time for his next hunt under the cloak of southern darkness. In his mind, the streets of Grimsby were a hunting ground, its people unsuspecting prey. Meanwhile, in the heart of the town, the discovery of a grotesque scene in a local farmer's field was about to shatter the fragile peace. The first light of dawn would reveal a truth so brutal and shocking, it would set off a chain of events that would engulf Grimsby in a nightmare from which there was no awakening. As dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight pierced the dark canopy of the woods surrounding Grimsby. The serene morning was a stark contrast to the terror that lay hidden among the tall stalks of the farmer's cornfield. Elias, a seasoned farmer whose family had tilled the land for generations, set out early to survey his crops. As he navigated through the rows of corn, a foul stench assaulted his nostrils. It was a smell he recognized, the scent of death. His heart raced as he pushed through the stalks, and then he saw it. Lying amidst the crushed corn was a body so brutally mutilated it was barely recognizable as human. Marks of savage butchery were evident, and the absence of certain body parts suggested an act of cannibalism. Elias stumbled back, horror gripping his heart, his scream piercing the morning calm. The news spread like wildfire, and soon, the local law enforcement, led by Detective James Holloway, arrived at the scene. Holloway, a man with deep-set eyes and a grim demeanor, had seen his share of gruesome scenes. But this was different. This was evil in its purest form. As Holloway examined the scene, he noted the precision in the mutilation, the removal of specific parts. This wasn't the work of a wild animal. It was deliberate, human. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he realized they were dealing with a monster hiding in plain sight. Meanwhile, the killer watched from the shadows, his appetite whetted by his recent hunt. He had been careful, leaving no trace behind except the horror of his act. Grimsby, with its decaying charm and oblivious residents, had been the perfect hunting ground for him. But now, with the discovery of the body, he knew the game was changing. As the town reeled from the shock, whispers began to circulate. Old stories, long buried, resurfaced. Tales of a cursed land, a family ostracized for their gruesome practices, and a child who disappeared into the woods, never to be seen again. Detective Holloway stood at the edge of the field, his eyes scanning the horizon. He knew this was just the beginning. The killer would strike again. It was a pattern he'd seen before. The thrill of the hunt, the addiction to the kill, and Holloway was determined to end it. But as the sun set, casting long shadows over Grimsby, the killer prepared once more. In the darkness of his lair, the plans for his next hunt took shape. The night was his ally, and the town his playground. The stage was set, and the dance of death was about to begin anew. The storm clouds gathered, and as the first drops of rain fell, the lines between predator and prey blurred. Grimsby was about to descend into a nightmare from which there was no waking, a tale of horror written in blood and darkness. Chapter 2. The Hunter in the Shadows. As night enveloped Grimsby, a chilling sense of foreboding settled over the town. The killer, cloaked in the anonymity of darkness, moved through the back alleys and deserted streets. His eyes, accustomed to the night, scanned for his next victim. His senses attuned to the slightest sound, the faintest movement. The residents of Grimsby, once carefree and trusting, now locked their doors and windows, casting fearful glances into the dark. But the killer was patient, a master of his craft. He knew the art of waiting, of choosing the right moment. On this night, his target was a lone traveler, a salesman who had wandered into town, unaware of the lurking danger. The killer watched him from a distance, studying his movements, his habits. He was a predator, and Grimsby was his territory. With a practiced charm and a disarming smile, the killer approached the salesman at a local bar. He spun tales of southern hospitality, of a place to stay for the night. The salesman, tired and grateful, followed him, not realizing the trap that was closing around him. The journey to the killer's house was a silent one, the only sound the crunch of gravel underfoot and the distant howling of a dog. The house itself stood like a specter, its walls holding secrets of unspeakable horrors. Inside, the killer's true nature revealed itself. His charm dissipated, replaced by a cold, ruthless efficiency. The salesman, paralyzed by fear, realized too late the fate that awaited him. The killer relished the terror in his victim's eyes, a twisted satisfaction in his control and power. The murder was methodical, ritualistic. The killer took his time, savoring each moment, each cut. And when it was over, he prepared his feast with a perverse reverence, a ritual passed down through generations, twisted and corrupted by time and madness. As dawn approached, the killer cleaned his sanctuary, erasing any trace of the night's events. He was meticulous, leaving nothing to chance. He knew the eyes of Grimsby were watching, the noose of suspicion tightening. Detective Holloway, meanwhile, pieced together the puzzle, his mind racing to connect the dots. The pattern was emerging, a signature in the brutality, a clue in the method. He knew he was dealing with someone deeply disturbed, someone who viewed the act of killing as an art. The town, once a haven, had become a hunting ground. Fear gripped the residents, whispers of a monster in their midst. The killer, emboldened by his success, planned his next move. He was a shadow, a ghost, unseen but ever present. And as Grimsby slept, unaware of the evil that walked its streets, the killer waited, his hunger growing, his desire for the hunt burning brighter. The dance of death continued, a macabre ballet performed under the cover of darkness. The hunter and the hunted, locked in a deadly embrace, a story of blood and shadows unfolding in the heart of the South. Chapter 3. The Tangled Web. In the wake of the recent horrors, Grimsby was a town under siege, its sense of security shattered. Detective Holloway, with his furrowed brow and relentless determination, spearheaded the investigation. The pressure was mounting. Each day without a lead, the killer grew bolder, the town's fear more palpable. Holloway dove into the town's archives, unearthing old records and forgotten tales. He found references to similar crimes, decades old, whispers of a family cast out for unspeakable acts. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly fitting together, forming a picture of generational horror. The townspeople, once silent, now spoke in hushed tones about their suspicions. Holloway listened, sifting through rumors and superstitions. He knew that in every myth there was a kernel of truth. Meanwhile, the killer, unseen yet omnipresent, continued to watch. He was no mere ghost. He was flesh and blood, walking among them, biding his time. He saw the fear in their eyes, the suspicion that turned neighbor against neighbor. It was a fear he relished, a chaos he adored. As Holloway delved deeper, he discovered a connection. A lineage that led back to a family long forgotten, their legacy of violence and madness. The killer, it seemed, was not just a random predator. He was a product of Grimsby's own dark past. The tension in the town escalated. People stayed indoors after dark, the streets deserted, the night alive with unspoken dread. The killer's shadow loomed large, a specter of death haunting their every step. In a race against time, Holloway pieced together the killer's pattern. He realized the killings were not random, they were targeted, each victim chosen for a reason. The killer was sending a message, a twisted declaration written in blood. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A local historian obsessed with the town's past approached Holloway with a dusty old journal. It belonged to a member of the ostracized family, filled with ramblings of rituals and retribution. Holloway pored over the journal, the words revealing a chilling prophecy, a cycle of violence destined to repeat. The killer was not just killing. He was fulfilling a legacy, a macabre destiny etched into his very being. As the pieces fell into place, Holloway realized the horrifying truth. The killer was closer than they thought, hiding in plain sight, a familiar face in the crowd. He was a son of Grimsby, born of its soil, fed by its sins. The realization sent a shockwave through the town. The killer was one of their own, a product of their collective history, their shared nightmares. He was the embodiment of their darkest fears, a mirror reflecting their own hidden savagery. And as Holloway raced to stop him, the killer prepared for his final act, his masterpiece. The town of Grimsby, once a peaceful haven, had become a stage for a terrifying finale, a climax to a symphony of screams and shadows. The final confrontation was imminent, a showdown between good and evil, truth and madness. The stage was set, the players ready. The curtain was about to rise on the last act of Grimsby's nightmare, a tale of blood and terror that would leave its mark on the town forever. Chapter 4. The Final Feast. Under the cloak of night, Grimsby transformed into a haunting tableau. Its streets bathed in an eerie moonlight. The killer, now fully immersed in his role, lurked in the shadows, his mind teeming with sinister anticipation. Tonight was the night of his grand finale, the culmination of his twisted symphony. A group of journalists, outsiders drawn to the town by the macabre events, became his chosen audience. They moved through Grimsby's streets, cameras in hand, unaware that they were stepping into a spider's web, the unseen arachnid waiting patiently in the dark. The killer observed them from a distance, his eyes glinting with malevolent glee. He had planned this moment meticulously, every detail crafted for maximum terror. The journalists, with their naive curiosity, were perfect pawns in his grisly game. He struck swiftly, like a viper. The first journalist, separated from the group, was grabbed from behind, a hand clamped over her mouth. Her muffled screams were the only sign of the horror unfolding in the dark alleyway. The killer relished her terror, the feel of her struggles beneath his powerful grip. One by one, he picked them off, each kill more vicious, more theatrical than the last. The sound of footsteps, a fleeting shadow, the briefest glimpse of a figure. He was a phantom, a specter of death playing a deadly game of cat and mouse. The town itself seemed complicit in his deeds. The wind whispered through the trees like ghostly spectators. The old buildings creaked and groaned as if in morbid delight. The darkness was alive, pulsating with an unspeakable dread. Detective Holloway, following a hunch, arrived at the scene too late. The alleyway was a nightmarish vision, painted in hues of crimson and black. He felt a chill run down his spine, the realization of the killer's true intent hitting him like a physical blow. The final journalist, cornered and trembling with fear, faced the killer in a desolate clearing. The moon cast long, sinister shadows around them, turning the scene into a grotesque dance of death. The killer's face, illuminated by the pale light, was a mask of insanity, his eyes burning with a hellish fire. In a final act of defiance, the journalist lunged at the killer, a desperate attempt to survive. But it was in vain. The killer, with a strength born of madness, overpowered him, his laughter echoing through the night like the sound of insanity itself. As he prepared his last feast, the killer savored the taste of fear and death. He was the master of this domain, the lord of this dance of despair. The moon, a silent witness to the carnage, cast its cold light on the scene, a spotlight on the final act of this macabre play. Chapter 5. The Reckoning. In the eerie calm of the pre-dawn hours, Grimsby lay under a shroud of despair. The killer returned to his lair, a grotesque sanctuary of his unspeakable deeds, unaware that his endgame was drawing near. Detective Holloway, fueled by a blend of rage and resolve, had unraveled the web of horrors and now stood at the threshold of the killer's domain. The house, a monument to the killer's madness, loomed ominously in the dim light. Holloway, his revolver drawn, stepped inside, each creak of the floorboard echoing through the silent halls. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a tangible reminder of the evil that resided within. The walls were adorned with macabre trophies, remnants of the killer's gruesome feasts. Holloway's stomach churned as he moved deeper into the hellish maze, each room revealing more of the killer's depraved acts. Jars filled with human teeth, furniture upholstered in human skin, the air heavy with the scent of rotting flesh. It was a tableau of terror, a gallery of the grotesque. In the kitchen, the heart of the killer's madness, the scene was ghastly. Blood-stained tools lay meticulously arranged on the counter, alongside bowls containing remnants of human organs. The floor was a canvas of crimson splatters, telling the tale of countless horrors. Holloway, his senses assaulted by the nightmare before him, heard a sound, a soft, sinister humming. It was the killer, emerging from the shadows, his eyes alight with a deranged glee. He spoke, his voice a chilling melody of madness, revealing the twisted logic of his actions, born from a traumatic past and a warped perception of retribution. The standoff was tense, a palpable electricity in the air. Holloway, facing the embodiment of human depravity, felt a surge of adrenaline. The killer, sensing his end, lunged with a feral intensity, a knife glinting in his hand. The struggle was brutal and unrelenting. Holloway, driven by a sense of justice, fought with a ferocity he never knew he possessed. The killer, fueled by insanity, matched him blow for blow. They crashed through the decrepit house, a symphony of grunts and the clash of metal filling the air. In the climax of their struggle, the killer pinned Holloway against the wall, his knife raised for a fatal strike. But in a desperate act, Holloway found an opening, his revolver thundering in the confined space. The bullet struck the killer in the chest, a spray of blood painting the walls. The killer, his face a mask of shock, stumbled back. Holloway watched as the life drained from his eyes, his body crumpling to the ground in a heap of bloodied flesh. The reign of terror had ended, but the cost was immense. As dawn broke, Holloway emerged from the house, a changed man. He had confronted the heart of darkness and prevailed, but the scars would remain. Grimsby, its innocence lost, would forever remember the night when evil walked its streets, a reminder of the fragile line between sanity and madness. The house, now a tomb of the killer's legacy, stood silent as the sun rose. The nightmare was over, but the echoes of the screams, the visions of the horror, would linger in the minds of those who survived. The story of Grimsby's cannibal killer would be etched in history, a grim testament to the depravity that lurks in the shadows of the human soul. Chapter 6. Echoes of the Forsaken. The sun rose over Grimsby, casting a gentle light over streets that had witnessed unspeakable horrors. Detective Holloway, standing amidst the remnants of the night's grim revelations, felt a profound weariness. The killer was gone, but the wounds he had inflicted on the town's psyche were deep and raw. The townspeople, once oblivious to the darkness among them, now faced the daunting task of healing. The streets, eerily quiet, were lined with houses where families mourned in silence, grappling with the reality of the nightmare that had unfolded in their midst. In the aftermath, Holloway walked the streets, his every step a reminder of the ordeal. He passed the local bar where the killer had ensnared his last victim, the alleys where screams had echoed, and the fields where bodies had been found. Each site was a macabre landmark in the geography of fear that Grimsby had become. The media descended upon the town, their cameras and questions intrusive, relentless. They sought to unravel the story of the killer, to understand the mind of a monster. But Holloway knew some depths were too dark to fathom, some evils too profound to explain. At the heart of this maelstrom stood the killer's house, now a grim monument. Holloway watched as authorities cordoned it off, a place of horrors too severe to be forgotten, yet too painful to remember. The house, with its blood-stained walls and echoes of madness, would be sealed, a tomb of secrets and sorrow. In the days that followed, memorials were held, candles lit in honor of the victims. The community, shattered, found solace in shared grief. Holloway attended the vigils, his presence a silent vow to those lost, a promise that their suffering would not be in vain. But even as the town began its slow journey towards healing, a haunting unease lingered. In quiet conversations, in the sidelong glances of passers-by, there was an acknowledgement that the horror had left an indelible mark. Grimsby had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had gazed back, leaving a shadow on their souls. As Holloway prepared to leave Grimsby, his mission complete, his thoughts turned to the future. He wondered about the scars that would remain hidden, the nightmares that would haunt dreams, and the stories that would be whispered in the dead of night. And then, in a neighboring town, a chilling discovery was made. Another body, another scene of unspeakable brutality. A cold realization settled over Holloway. The nightmare wasn't over. It had merely shifted its gaze. The horror that had consumed Grimsby was not confined to one town, one killer. It was a lurking evil, a darkness that moved silently, insidiously, through the heart of the unsuspecting. Grimsby's tale was over, but the echoes of the Forsaken would resonate long after, a whispering specter in the annals of horror. Make sure to like and subscribe for more stories.